Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of the book Radical Candor and Just Work.
I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast. And today we're going to talk about how to give feedback to, how to coach, how to advocate for someone who is described as a thoughtful, introverted employee in a culture where multitasking extroverts are rewarded. And we'll explore what each of these words mean in greater detail. I'm going to go start reading this letter. It's somewhat lengthy, so I have given Kim and Jason permission to jump in with interruptions. So off we go. Quote, I'm a senior manager at a Big Four consulting firm. I've been here 12 years. I love building teams, mentoring, and sharing advice on how to navigate the complexities of our firm. However, while I'm really good at sharing big picture advice, I found I'm really struggling to provide advice to people to explain how to get them ready for promotion to the next level.
I just want to say I feel this person's pain. Promotions are often sort of what it means to get promoted and why you get promoted is something that is opaque at too many organizations, I think. And often, I mean, I remember one of the worst experiences I had, but also I understood my manager. It wasn't her fault, but I was not getting promoted. And she said, this company is kind of like a family. I'm like, oh, and I'm not in the family? But I knew what she meant. I mean, I think she was being honest with me about how it was. And that's the tricky thing about being a manager in a situation like this, where it's not clear to anyone. And now you have to explain to your employee this like nebulous, kind of slightly unfair promotion criteria.
Yeah, and it's actually kind of ironic because this person is saying, I'm really good at sharing big picture advice, sort of nebulous stuff, but actually how to get you ready for promotion, that might be a different kind of vague.
All right, so let's see what's going on.
So this person describes themselves, I'm a fairly easygoing person, bit of a people pleaser. I always look for the best in people, which means I tend to accept someone's personality for what it is and not ask the right questions to help push them harder. Does that sound like flavors of ruinous empathy on that?
Potentially.
Maybe
I don't know.
I'm projecting. I'm just putting myself into this.
But I think one should accept another person's personality for what it is. I mean, I think that's the right. You don't want to give people feedback about their personality, right? You want to let them know specifically what they can do to get the promotion if they want it.
Well, it's very interesting because we go from accepting someone's personality, not asking the right questions to help push them harder. I realize this makes creating deliverables harder and can sometimes create extra work for others.
There's a hint in here that I want to come back to. Yeah, I think there's a difference between letting someone shine and accepting sort of work habits or behaviors that actually make them and other people around them less productive, even though they might be good in other ways.
Well said. In talking with leadership about why folks might not be ready for promotion, I've heard them say things as vague as, we're not sure what he does all day, or she makes things harder to complete than it needs to be. But those aren't super tangible and can be hard to provide actionable feedback on.
I have to say that when I read the words, we're not sure what he does all day, it was like fingernails on a chalkboard. Like, of course, like, is that this person's fault or is that your fault? Like, often there's, and she makes it harder to complete work than it needs to be. Like, also that both of these statements strike me as like superhighways for bias.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that sounds like quite an interesting rock album. Okay. So I tried to explain he was working with team members one-on-one or reviewing documents before they were finalized or cross-referencing complicated regulations against each other or training other people up. But some of that stuff isn't quite as sexy as, quote, completed a deliverable. Maybe there's a better way to frame what they're doing.
So when my husband, Andy, first moved to Silicon Valley, he had a friend who said to him, in Silicon Valley, management is neither taught nor rewarded. And unfortunately, it seems to me like that's part of what's going on. Is that this person is a manager and this person is a colleague who's helping others get their work done, and which is what a manager should do. And this person is not claiming credit for other people's work and now is being penalized for it. So I'm feeling the pain here. That's my assumption of what's going on. Maybe I'm wrong.
Go back into the letter. The culture I'm working within favors multitaskers, quick problem solvers. So the folks who are more thoughtful thinkers and doing the behind the scenes soft skill stuff aren't always seen as the leaders. It's hard to explain to them what they're doing wrong because they might be taking all the right steps, but maybe just not moving as quickly as someone else would. Possibly for good reason, though, if the work is super detail oriented.
So I am a tremendous expert in consulting, having worked at a consulting firm for 12 whole weeks between my 2 years of business school. And one of the things that I noticed when I was there is that postulatory boldness is rewarded perhaps more than it ought to be. And by postulatory boldness, what I really mean is bloviating bullshit.
Is that like somebody saying, I'm an expert in consulting, having worked there for 12 weeks?
Yes, exactly. I learned.
So you did. You are an expert.
I learned how to be a bloviating bullshitter. I'm not proud of it, but I can do it. I want to make sure that we come back to that idea, but keep going.
Okay. Sometimes it seems like the feedback you need to give ties more to how to alter the perception you're giving off to others. So it doesn't seem like dragging feet or excuse giving, as opposed to needing to give feedback on how to do the actual work. This is the feedback that feels harder to give. It doesn't feel super fair to give, but also it's hard to envision that person acting at the next level when they can't seem to push things ahead in a way that feels meaningful. And while the things the culture favors are a little bit of a bummer for folks who are more thoughtful thinkers, it also feels like they need to work within that system that's been created. Sometimes even telling someone to take more ownership over deliverables, or here's a new phrase, develop an executive presence with clients, doesn't even feel super tangible.
Executive presence? Yeah. More fingernails on the chalkboard.
That just...
So we'll come back to
that.
All
right. I couldn't help but editorialize on that. So taking more ownership over deliverables, or the proverbial quote, executive presence, doesn't even feel super tangible. But also, I even have the problem of identifying the actual problem enough to get that far. I just assume that's the cost of working with this person. Closing it out, do you have any tips for turning the quote, something's just not quite right or ready, into actionable feedback to help people make it to the next level?
Jason, you want to start? What do you think?
To have this conversation, I think we need to set aside an assumption, which is, or we need to accept an assumption. And the assumption is that this person is performing, that they're describing, that they're trying to give feedback to, is actually performing very well. Because there are a couple of places in the note where they hint at the idea that they may not actually be performing that well. I mean, some of their behavior might be slowing other people down, or they may be inefficient. So in addition to this sort of perception problem, there are a couple of places that hint at that there might actually be a performance problem here. But I think that's not the sort of thrust of the note. And so I wanted to call that out and then say, like, let's set that aside. Let's have this conversation in the context of, there's a person who maybe operates a bit differently than the cultural expectations that are set for most people who are quote unquote leaders. They perform well, meaning that like the work that they produce and that their team produces is of high quality. It's delivered in a timely fashion. It's solving client problems. And I think that there's a really interesting conversation that we can have about that. So I want to put it out there that I was having this feeling, and other people might have heard it in the reading of it, but I think we should set it aside and have the conversation about the sometimes disconnect between a person sort of maybe the things that a person may be more likely, behaviors a person may be more likely to have if they're sort of quote unquote more introverted, or maybe more of a support, Kim, as you were describing, as opposed to the what was your word?
The postulatory boldness or
yes, less postulatorily bold.
Yeah. So I think that I agree. Let's start by sort of assuming that there is some feedback that we can give this person that will help this person succeed in this organization without becoming, giving them feedback about their personality. And there's an interesting book that I blurbed. I just read it. It's called Think Faster, Talk Smarter. And the author of that book is Matt Abrahams, who's at Stanford. And he really is very helpful in terms of if you're not comfortable in these environments that sort of demand these quick, here's a way to develop that doesn't force you to become a bloviating bullshitter, that allows you to be sort of true to yourself and to dig deep when you need to, but also allows you to be successful in a world that kind of rewards that kind of thinking faster, talking smarter. A cynic could say this is about how to be a bloviating bullshitter, but that's not what this book is about. It's a great book because I think there's some very actionable advice in that book.
Mm.
Was there anything, Kim, that leapt out at you or that you recall as if that's not your specific style of how to build the muscle?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of it is sort of, first of all, recognizing that remaining silent in the moment is not actually a gift to other people. But you have good thoughts. And even though you may not be 100% sure that you're right, like sharing your hypotheses is just as important as sharing your conclusions. And so I think that was helpful. And also, he talks about, for example, what to do at events that feel like small talk. Because I think often like a cocktail party or a dinner party sometimes feels like you're like mired in this small talk nonsense. And sort of figuring out how to go a little deeper with people and actually have meaningful conversations in those situations.
Kim, tell me if I'm misinterpreting, but since I have read the book, based on your description, what I'm getting from you is that it might be valuable to help people build a stronger muscle to interface with the culture on the terms that it already values. So like if thinking fast and speaking your mind clearly are valued in the organization, some of the feedback might be, let's help you build a muscle so that you can interact more effectively in those situations.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I think that was one reaction that I was having is I tend to be a more thoughtful thinker. I tend to be a person who takes time to process. But I've had some experiences working in environments that were not that were very sort of like supercharged, intellectual, fast moving. And what I found was it took me time to become comfortable. It's so interesting that this is the advice in the book, but one of the things that really helped me was to distinguish between what I thought, like what I was hypothesizing, and what I knew to be true.
Yeah.
And that gave me a lot more, like that split gave me a lot more confidence. So it's really interesting to see that someone who's thought about this quite a lot says like that is an actual useful tactic because it worked really well for me. I just didn't have the book to guide me to that conclusion.
Yeah, I'll share an experience I had when I was working at this consulting firm. So we were working at a steel mill, and the CEO of the steel mill wanted to get into plastics. And he named this one kind of plastic. And I was supposed to have become an expert on all plastics in advance of this meeting. And instead, I had gone to spend the weekend with my boyfriend, and I had not become an expert on all
you could have just watched The Graduate.
Yeah. Well, there's all these different kinds of plastic, so I had the research. And so he said, what I'm really interested in is this one kind of plastic. And I had glanced quickly at the different types. And I knew enough to know that this particular kind of plastic you could put hot things into.
Mm-hmm.
all I had gotten to was that you could pour milk into this particular kind of plastic, which needs to be heated if it's gonna, but I thought, beer, I bet this guy he was like a motorcycle rider. I was like, I bet this guy's more interested in beer than milk. And I said, yeah, the really interesting thing about this plastic is you could have beer in plastic bottles. Just making it up.
Mm-hmm.
And as it turned out, I was exactly right. And he was like, yes, you get it.
This is so fascinating. I would never say something like,
well, I mean, I figured at worst they would say I was wrong,
Yeah.
And so it wasn't pure bullshit. I knew a little bit, and I had an instinct about this person, the CEO, and what he would be interested in. And I remember my boss at the consulting firm, his eyes got big. He's like, how did she know that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, can I just reflect on that, Kim, because you're bringing me back to business school when I was really quite shocked by the folks that had been trained in consulting that would have a case and they would just say, oh yeah, well, there's about 300 million people and 80% of that and a growth rate of that. And so it's obvious this. And I'm just sitting there like, they say it with such confidence.
Yes.
Like, this must be so. And yet I'm like, but I don't think this is necessarily so. And so I'm curious, with that from the book about the stating it as a hypothesis, had you said to that CEO, you might be able to use it for beer. I don't know, but it's possible.
That would have been a better way to say it.
Oh, but you actually think it would? See, I don't know. Do you think how much of it was your confidence in that?
So no, I think I had just lucked on to something. And so I think actually stating it as a hypothesis rather than asserting it as a fact, which I got lucky, but I could have gotten unlucky, and he would have been like, "Didn't you read the study? That's impossible," So I think it's safer. I was taking a gamble, and I won in this case, the gamble. But I think being clear about what here's another example. Well, I'm not going to go there. Swallowing bleach. Why couldn't
Yeah.
Got it. He got that one wrong. So I think the point is that postulatory boldness can be very dangerous unless you do what you suggested, Amy, which is saying this is a hypothesis, not a fact. And then all of a sudden it's a great gift because it can allow, the whole point of getting to the truth is to say, here's what could be. Let's figure out if I'm right or if I'm wrong, and to be equally happy if you're right or if you're wrong. And I think learning how to do that, I think often people go the opposite direction. So they hear me making stuff up. And in the case of that consulting firm, they were impressed, but it could, if you had been there, Amy, or if my sister had been there, she would have been like, Kim, you were making shit up again.
Oh God, now we're drinking beer from plastic.
And also, who wants to drink beer from a plastic bottle? But that's another.
I was as you all were saying this, I think there's a way to state a hypothesis with sort of excitement and positivity that would have a similar impact. So I think you could say, as I was reading this study, one thought that I had is what if we could put beer in this plastic?
Way better way.
And now all of a sudden you haven't put yourself out so far on a limb. You're saying this was an idea that occurred to me, and you might still get the same excited reaction from the motorcycle driving CEO.
Yeah. But Amy, I wonder, business school, sort of like this environment that this listener is writing about, was sort of similar. Business school was another environment that really rewarded postulatory boldness, shall we say. So what are some other ways other than just because if you feel like the game is silly, then or even flawed, then it's hard to tell someone to play a game. But if you take a step back and say, what is good about this game? What there's a reason why people pay these consultants as much as they do to come in and talk. It's because they get some stuff right. They, or they expand thinking in some way. So, and I think as we were reading, we were picking up on the listener clearly has some of these questions about like executive presence, like that, so
what do
there's
they do all day?
yeah, there's something unfair about this kind of situation that rewards postulatory boldness, but there also is something good about it. So if you look for what's good about it, assuming that you want to stay there, then you might have a better experience.
Kim, what you said got me thinking, what is good about boldly sharing your ideas? And I think, to your point, part of the job of being a consultant is to change thinking, to provoke new thinking. And one helpful way to provoke thinking is to boldly share your idea, confidently and boldly share your idea, because you're exactly right that it is risky, that people may, for good reason, disagree with you. But you, just by eliciting that disagreement, you have like done the client a favor, right? By saying, here's this idea, and someone says, no, you're wrong. You can't do that. And here's why. Knowledge has been created in that process. Like something has been learned as a result of that. So there's value in that. I also was thinking about the sort of cognitive biases that we have and how that affects our perception of the work that other people do. And I do think that in some ways we're fighting an exposure or recency bias. Like for a person who's doing that frequently, you have been exposed to the times when it goes right, even if they make mistakes. Like you've been exposed to the times that it goes right. So you at least have these data points where you're like, oh, this person has these interesting ideas. But if the person is quietly working behind the scenes and not sharing those interesting ideas, they may actually be doing the client and the other people on the team a disservice, because people may not be learning from the things that they are learning, right? They may not have those moments of like encountering the thought or idea that this other manager, the quiet sort of thoughtful thinker manager, is having, and therefore may not be advancing the sort of thinking on the team as quickly as they could.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I also will say, like, part of the reason why I didn't do all the research that I was tasked with doing on plastics is that as I looked at it, fundamentally, I believed, my hypothesis was that it was a bad idea to go into. I mean, this was a steel mill. Like, why go in? And I think that by being willing to engage with what excited him about the plastics, he was more open to hearing my fundamental suggestion, which is that he didn't have any particular advantage in going into plastics, and what he needed to do was continue. He was kind of it's like steel is boring, but like he was running a steel mill. What he needed to do was run the steel mill. And I think that if I had started with that hypothesis instead of engaging on the conversation about plastics, we wouldn't have had as good a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jason, you brought up a really important distinction around the role of someone working in consulting is to actually challenge ideas. And so part of that is what is valued in an organization, in a culture. Kim, we've been talking about how do we actually communicate, quote, soft skill accomplishments in an organization that might not value them, or how do we measure activities across the board? And in Radical Candor, you wrote that Google, quote, tends to reward people who do the most visible projects rather than those who make important breakthroughs behind the scenes. And you also wrote, measuring activities and visualizing workflows will push you and your team to make sure you really understand how what you all do drives success or doesn't. Measuring activities, displaying them publicly also tends to lead to ratings and promotions that more consistently reward the top performers and are less prone to the biases that bedevil us all, end quote. And I just wanted to acknowledge, just even on our team call today, Jason, you were talking about how you might want to build a dashboard that could actually visually show us more about the sales pipeline and acknowledging the contributions of the team. So, Jason, maybe I'll have you start about, from your own experience, the value of visualizing these kinds of workflows and accomplishments.
Well, it is certainly helpful for other people, like for people to be able to know what your team is working on. So if you have some sort of tool or process by which you take the things that are implicit, that are going on inside people's heads, and you make them explicit, you write them down or display them visually or make it possible for other people to benefit from them, you do help with all the things that Kim said, and you also help with organizational learning, right? Because when I write down, here's what I was working on, here's a problem I ran into, and here's how I solved it, that knowledge is not only useful to me and to my prospects for promotion, it is also useful to anybody else who runs into a similar problem and might be looking for a way to solve it, right? They might be stumped and be looking for a way to solve it. So I found that is it is helpful for your own prospects. It's helpful for other people's learning, but it is also helpful for your own development. The act of externalizing what you are doing helps you to understand, where am I spending my time? Do I feel good about the balance of time that I'm spending on this set of tasks versus that set of tasks? I remember at Khan Academy, we had this thing called the Big Board. And the Big Board was essentially a Kanban board. Even though we were like a tech company, we built this board out of felt. So there's like this big board, like on rolling whiteboards with these felt stickers that you got to put up. And essentially what we asked each person to do is every week they would pick a red, yellow, green. The projects would be written across the top. And then every week you would pick a red, yellow, or green, and you get to put your felt sticker on there, like how is the project doing? And that was paired with a quick 30 to 90 second update that we would do in a standing meeting. And what we encourage people to do is like share something that either went well or something that you're challenged with. And the goal of doing that was explicitly to like increase awareness in the organization of what people are doing, but also give people the opportunity to ask for help, to say like, hey, I'm stuck on something. Here's a place where I could use help. And so like we had to,
Jason,
we
can I just like jump in on this? Because I don't know if this is where you're going, but, and maybe it's even the word felt, I don't know, but the very act of something being in like felt, which actually I'm aware, like I haven't experienced a lot of felt lately, like it makes it fuzzier and like, okay, like the felt red thing doesn't feel like,
a red
it just
flag.
feels like it's, it feels sort of like, oh, there's like a stuffed animal telling me it's okay.
I need some help.
Yeah. And we were a partially remote team. So like we actually, we had to take pictures of the board. Now we didn't change the state of the board very often. The board didn't contain a ton of other information. What we encouraged people to do was we had like little short links that described the project, and you would actually, if you wanted to go learn more, it was a quick way to go see what that team was working on. You could follow the little link that was written under the name of their project. But what I remember about it, like being so powerful, in addition to the tactile nature of it, was that it forced people, me included, to stop and think about what they were doing. And this was an incredibly valuable activity for all the reasons that I've just said. And so even if this person's goal was not to help with promotion, but instead to like increase the productivity of their team, I think a process like the one we're describing would be helpful. So it has so many, there's multiple layers of benefits of taking the time to make what is implicit explicit, to write down the things that are in your head and make it clear to other people what you and the team that you're working on are doing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, one of the most useful things I ever did when I became a manager was to create a pie chart of how I was spending my time every week. And I coded things, and like that was when I learned I was spending like 2 hours a day in email, and realized I needed to change the way I dealt with that, because that was not a good use of time. But I would never have realized that if I hadn't taken the time. Part of what I was saying when I was talking about what we did at Google, I mean, part of the problem was that I was leading online sales and operations teams, and that was often called self-serve, which implied that the customers were serving themselves. We were doing nothing, and we were we were doing a lot of work, and responsible for 2/3 of Google's revenue. But often there was this assumption that that was all auto magically happening, and it wasn't. It wasn't. There were a lot of people. It was almost like we were in the Wizard of Oz. There's some person actually behind the screen, and you think it's magic. So anyway, I think that is one thing to consider. It's like making sure that your deliverables are recognized, that people know what the activities of your team are. But in this case, I think part of what's happening is that the organization is not valuing management. They're valuing doing the work as opposed to managing people who are doing the work. And that's tricky. So I think part of what needs to happen is that this person who wrote in needs to go talk to their leaders and say, look, management takes time. Management's a real thing. We can measure what managers do. And here's what managers do. They're spending time one-on-one with each of their team members. And it's tricky in this case because you want managers to do this work and to give their teams credit for the work.
Yep.
And I had an experience where I went out on maternity leave, and I was very proud of myself. Like I had set my team. I'd spent a lot of time like what I thought was setting my team up for success. And when they succeeded, somebody told me, "See, you're not necessary, Kim, because you weren't even here." And I was like, "Wait a minute." I did the right thing. And now you're telling me because I did the right thing, I'm not necessary. So I think that is a hard thing to solve. That's why I started with part of the problem that I'm reading in this is that this may be an organization where management is neither taught nor valued. And I think it's really important to change that culture.
Well, I have a couple questions. One is the conversations that we might recommend this person have. So one of them you're saying is actually this person talking to their manager. So I do want to get to that. But before we do, Jason, I was curious about what might you have this person say to their direct report around the making things visual? I just want to make sure that we're really clear on that. Like whether it's the pie chart or whether it's the big board, how would you actually kind of roll that out with that team member so that you felt like it was as effective as it could be?
Well, I don't know if that specific thing would work in this particular organization, but I think in the note, the person hints at this, and I think they need to have a very direct conversation, which is, I understand that you want to get promoted. In this organization, in order to get promoted, people need to understand the value that you are bringing to the company and to our clients. And so our job is going to be to figure out how we can help other people understand the value we bring to the company and our clients. And one way we could do that is by making the work that you're doing more visible to other people. And here's Jason's example from the podcast of like a thing they did at Khan Academy as a way to get the ball rolling. But I think that's the conversation that you owe to the person, is to say, this is one of the criteria that is going to be critical to your success if your goal is promotion, is to make sure that other people understand your work.
And I think one way to do that would be to advise this person to share very publicly the accomplishments of the people who work for them.
Yep.
So to send an email out and to send it upwards, to send it to your boss's boss.
Yep.
I'm so proud of so-and-so on my team who did this.
Yep.
And that's not something that the person who did the work is likely to do. So I think one of your jobs as a manager is to get visibility for the people who are working for you. And usually in an organization that has a hierarchy, when you're sending those messages out, bragging about the things your people are doing and giving your people credit, some of that credit comes back to you as that person's manager. So I think it's both a good thing to do for the people who work for them, and it's also good for you. So that's one way to get more visibility into accomplishments.
I love how simple and straightforward that is. And I would also echo something that I hear all the time from clients, which is that one of the challenges that managers have is their job in some respect is to make it look like everything's going smoothly. And so they're like, it's the sort of like the duck problem I think we referred to before, which is like on the surface of the water, the duck appears to be gliding, but underneath the water, they're kicking furiously in order to like make motion happen. And you forget that it's actually important for people to understand the work you're doing to make the motion happen. I think that your tip is so great. And it is also creating a model for your team members to do with you. Right?
Yes.
So which is also really helpful as a manager, because you don't always see all the work that your team members are doing in order to make them successful. So if you think of if this person's sort of a director and they're talking to a manager who's managing individual people, if those folks want to become managers someday, you're creating a model that will help them demonstrate the kind of work that they are doing that is helping the team be more successful and communicate that upwards and outwards.
And I think that kind of sort of upwards communication, like letting the sort of your boss's boss know what the people who work for you are. So now you're bringing information that's 3 levels down up. And sometimes that feels like, do they really need to know that? But usually that person is happy to know this good thing has happened. And all they have to do is hit reply and say, this is really impressive, so and so.
Yep.
And so it gives them an opportunity to reach down into the organization, which is usually a welcome opportunity. So I think also the person who wrote in could do this for the person, could say, because wherever you are, you can sort of, you have standing to send an email a couple of levels up in the, I hate the words up, down, and sideways. I don't know how else to talk about a hierarchy though, but you have an opportunity to send an email that the person working for you doesn't. And so bragging about the accomplishments of the people who are working for you, I think is part of your job as a manager. And it's also part of how you make sure that people know what you and your team are doing.
Yep.
That's great. And Kim, it kind of brings us back to where you were going before, which is that you were sharing that, this person might be working in an organization where management isn't taught or valued. And so one of the things that this person can do is actually to sort of model the kind of behavior that they want to show by those kinds of upwards bragging, specific and sincere praise, et cetera. Any other specific tips? Like what else can you do as a manager in the middle of an organization if you feel like that skill of management isn't valued?
Yeah. Before we move on, I want to offer another rationale for doing this upwards email thing, which is that if this person who wants to get promoted is worried that, is not likely to brag about themselves, which often people are not. Certain personalities are like, I have no problem bragging about myself because I learned this lesson of postulatory boldness. But I find that when I've worked with managers who are sort of more thoughtful, less apt to be the bloviating BSer, they are very eager to offer credit to other people, to offer praise to other people. And so this becomes a much easier way of sort of making your work visible than making your work visible. You're making the work of the people who work for you visible. Yeah. And that feels more altruistic and therefore more comfortable to a lot of people.
I'm really curious just to follow up on that because I've been in some situations where it's always much easier for me to praise someone else than myself. And or to advocate or to really go far and cheerlead. And so I have had assumptions where my manager in a very hierarchical organization was sharing my accomplishments. I had kind of an assumption because I wasn't doing that. There were other people that were sort of more tooting their own horn. And I learned that actually was not happening. And so I'm curious, like, how would you then communicate back besides the email, like just being very intentional to this person, like hold me accountable to sing your praises or whatnot? Like, how do you close that loop to make sure that the person doesn't have this assumption that you're going to bat for them and then they find out there was
you're
no
not
bat.
going,
there was no bat.
Yeah. Well, I think that another way to make sure that you're owning the communication about your work to the people who are going to decide about your promotion is public praise, like praising the people who you work with. Say, I've been working on this project and so really helped me do that. Now, all of a sudden you're, I mean, and you have to mean it. You don't want this to feel, this could feel manipulatively insincere. But part of your goal is really has to be genuinely to praise that other person. But a nice benefit of praising that other person is it gives you an opportunity to share a little bit about what you're working on as well when you're working with people. So I think that can be really helpful. Another thing that I will say in terms of communicating this sort of stuff upwards one of the things that I did when I was at Google is I developed this class called Email Haiku, which was about how to write a really short email, and which is especially important if you're going to send a note to your boss or to your boss's boss or to your boss's boss's boss. Like the more seniority a person has in an organization, often the less time and the less patience they have. And usually, like my daughter's school is always like, we want to teach leaders. We want to teach women to be leaders. And I'm like, well, you should be admitting every child who has ADHD in the Bay Area, because those are going to be the leaders. Like, the leaders really have a short attention span, is what I'm saying. And so I think that you need to adapt your communication style to that. So if you're going to send these emails out, you want to make the email, you need to make sure that it can fit in the body of an iPhone with someone who's using big text, right? And that's all they're going to read. So you have, like, at most, 2 sentences, and then you can attach other stuff. And so making sure that you're sort of using formatting and sending emails out that are no longer than a tweet is really important and I'm going to still call it a tweet, is really important for communication upwards, and for making that, punchy kind of communication style that's going to be effective in an organization where people, it sounds like, people are constantly being interrupted.
I think the idea of the email, the tip on the content, keeping the content really brief, I feel strongly that there's like a classic problem that we're running into here, which is and it probably happens in consulting as much or more than in other organizations, where we don't focus on the good stuff. Like, to keep things simple, like there's just like, right? It's like, focus on the good stuff. Like, what's good that is happening that this person is doing. I have another idea that I wanted to share, which might be helpful to this person, which I found really useful, especially when it came time to actually putting together a promotion packet for somebody, to actually say, to advocate on somebody's behalf that they should be promoted. And that was to think about the story that you're telling. And from my perspective, to help people who are behind the scenes folks become managers, or like to get promoted. The story that I often told had a shape somewhat similar to, we were trying to do this thing, we were doing it piecemeal. This person came and made order from chaos, and all of a sudden we have a result that we could never have gotten if this person was not in the position they are in, leading this project. And that is the true story that I told of great behind the scenes leaders who wound up delivering outsized results with small. And I would often emphasize, like, this person didn't have a huge team. They did this with limited resources. They produced far more value than the resources that we gave them. This person is a value generating machine for this company, and they should be recognized for promotion. Because I think the value that the bloviating BSer has is more obvious, right? They're talking about it more. And so the story may be sort of more available to more of the people who are in that committee. But if the people are raising these types of questions, I think you do have to give them a narrative. This isn't for the email. This is for, like, when you actually get them ready for promotion. You have to tell a good story about how that person is delivering value. And I think if you do that, and you can do that honestly, like you can do that authentically for this person, that is also going to be incredibly valuable praise and feedback to give to them directly. It's going to help them in their development. So it's, again, 2 birds, 1 stone. Like, it serves multiple purposes to work on that story.
These are such great tips, and I feel like we could go in a few different directions, but can you just indulge me for a moment and get your take on the phrase executive presence, Kim?
Boo.
Yeah. That's usually when I've been told I need to work on my executive presence, what people are really saying is, can't you turn into a man? So I'm just going to say that. And if I were Black, I would probably assume that I'm being told, "Can't you be white?" And or if I were not white, I would be, So I think that it is really important to remember that, executive presence is a super highway for bias. And it's important to impress people who are a couple of levels above you if you want to get promoted. And that is why I like the book, Think Faster, Talk Smarter, is that it really it doesn't talk about executive presence. It talks about things in a very specific way. Here's what's going on. Here's what you can do to make your ideas. If you try to think about, your goal is not quote unquote executive presence, but your goal is to help get information to people who are extremely busy and very distracted quickly, so that they can make better use of it. Then it feels less like bloviating BS and more like an efficiency play. And for me, at least, that's way more palatable than executive presence. I have a question, though, Jason.
Yeah.
Have you been told to work on your executive presence ever?
Yes.
Okay, so see there, I had this bias that you wouldn't have since you're a man, a white man, and you have. So I think it would be cool to hear about your story and what it was like for you to be told that.
This happened to me as I made the transition from management to sort of executive leadership, when I was no longer just a manager of managers. I also had an executive function in an organization, and I had all the practices that we're talking about, like talking about my accomplishments with my team and making sure that I was deferring to them and sharing all of the credit and all this other stuff. But what I didn't realize is that as an executive, you have a different kind of player coach role. Like, you're on an executive team, you're a teammate on an executive team. And what was happening was I was like, well, my team thinks this, my team thinks that. And my teammates were like, well, what do you think?
Yeah.
And that was really the crux of the problem I had. That triggered the feedback. You need to work on your executive presence, because this team of executives is expecting something from you. And that is to be a member of this team, not just a representative of the organization that works for you.
Yeah, that's really an important point. I think when you, at a certain point in time, your team are your peers, not the people working for you. And the people working for you.
Of course, yeah. It was both, but people felt like I was failing to embody my executive role, and I was living as sort of in my functional role.
Yes, yeah, and I got that feedback as well, and that was actually not a super highway to bias. That was that was true. I was making that mistake.
Well, that's interesting that you both got, like, maybe we need to spend some time on that, if that is a pretty common mistake for folks.
It's a really interesting conversation. Like, what changes when you transition from like a director role to an executive role? Like, because we often talk about the difference between an individual contributor and a manager and director.
Before we get to our tips, anything that we haven't said, Kim? I feel like there's probably a story rolling around your head.
Well, I wanted to say one thing about the superhighway to bias, which is I was given the feedback, you need to work on your executive presence, and it was actually feedback about a real thing. So the advantage of being a white man in this case was that I was being judged on a standard that was more likely to match the behavior I was already inclined to show.
Yeah. And I was given the same feedback, and it was also real feedback. And I was also told another time, you need to work on your executive presence. Don't wear a pink sweater, wear a blue sweater. Literally.
Oh my God.
I mean, this is
this is the world we live in. And I think there's actually another interesting point about that, which is that sometimes when you get this kind of non-feedback feedback, this kind of bias masquerading as feedback, it can make you shut down to all feedback. And that's dangerous. Like, I needed to hear the feedback that I was treating my direct reports as my team and not my peers as my team. Like, that was bad. That was a mistake I was making. And that is part of the executive. Terms like executive presence have become so abstract that they're meaningless. So I think it's about being specific, really specific, really clear about what behaviors you're talking about, not something that's too abstract. I think that the important thing is to try not to be too cynical about sort of the executive function stuff. I think focus on bragging about this person's accomplishments, getting them to brag about the accomplishments of their people, and to sort of not think about having to show think faster, talk smarter. Don't think about it in terms of BS, but think about it in terms of saving other people time.
Yep. And you'll be happier focusing on the good stuff, talking about the accomplishments that the folks that work for you are having. I guarantee you will end the day feeling better about all the work that your team is doing also.
I have one other last thought for this person, which is if you tell the person who's trying to get promoted if you ask this person to send you an email every week bragging about a couple of things that people on their team have done, and then you offer to forward that up the chain, that will help them a lot.
Now it's time for our Radical Candor checklist. These are tips you can use to start putting Radical Candor into practice.
Tip number 1, you don't have to be certain about your conclusions in order to share your hypothesis. Sometimes just sharing what if is really helpful.
Tip number 2, if you're not comfortable bragging about yourself as a manager, go ahead, brag about your team's accomplishments and give specific and sincere praise to peers who have helped you.
Tip number 3, be as clear as possible about what it will take for your direct report to get promoted. Even if you're not 100% sold on the criteria for promotion, share them as clearly as you can.
Tip number 4, email haiku. Make sure that you are as brief as possible when sharing important information to your boss or your boss's boss. Think one iPhone screen with a really big font.
Tip number 5, think about the story you're telling when trying to support your team for promotion. Show specifically how they're creating value for the company and clients beyond what would be possible without their management.
Tip number 6, buy Think Faster, Talk Smarter.
It's filled with practical, tactical advice. This book is indispensable. Kim Scott, best-selling author of Radical Candor.
Yes.
There you are.
Blurbed by yours truly.
Blurbed by yours truly. Well, for more tips, go ahead to radicalcandor.com/resources. Download our free learning guides. Sign up for Radical Candor on Masterclass. Get our lit video book. Register for a workplace comedy series, The Feedback Loop, and so much more. Show notes for this episode, radicalcandor.com/podcast. Do we have a favorite thing for today? I think the book is our favorite thing, apparently.
I have a favorite thing. Hang on one second.
Let me keep rolling. I'm going to roll. I'm going to vamp by reminding you to praise in public and private and criticize in private. If you like what you hear, please do rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Of course, if you have criticism for us, we welcome it. Radically candid criticism, of course, and that's at podcast@radicalcandor.com. Shall we talk about our favorite things?
And now for a few of our favorite things. In my continuing effort to eliminate plastic from my daily life, I'm going to share with you my deodorant.
The irony after this whole episode was about you're selling plastic to a steel manufacturer.
Yes,
not selling plastic to a steel manufacturer.
I convinced him to keep making steel and stop polluting our planet. Did you know, I think I've said this before, but we use as much oil and gas in plastic as we do in our cars. Okay, so that is part of why I'm determined to get rid of my little plastics. And this is my new deodorant, native deodorant in 100% plastic-free cardboard.
Oh, and Kim, you're on video, so do you want to actually give a play-by-play of what you're doing?
So
show, don't tell.
Yeah, show, don't tell.
Don't show.
So I'm just opening up my deodorant, which is a nice gray color. I chose charcoal, but there's all kinds of flavors of native deodorant. We'll put a link to it in the show notes.
All right. Should we get Andy on to see what he actually thinks of it?
He uses it too.
Oh, all right. So
we both use it, and as does my son. I haven't persuaded my daughter, even though she complains all the time that we've left her a mess on the planet. I can't get her using this deodorant, but I will.
Well, on that note, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for sharing your plug for native deodorant. Thank you for writing in. Thanks to everyone who shares their challenges. We learn just as much, if not more, from you. And we so appreciate your commitment to practicing radical candor. Bye for now.
Bye.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.